The humid air hung heavy over the dense jungles of the Pacific, a relentless cloak that seemed to smother the very breath of those who dared to fight beneath its canopy. It was here, amid tangled foliage and the distant roar of artillery, that Japanese warriors first encountered the American GIs, men who were unlike any adversary they had faced before. One officer, Lieutenant Hayashi, later recalled the initial shock. The GIs were unlike any enemy we had faced. Their resilience was both baffling and formidable. This reflection, etched in the diaries of many who survived the opening clashes, captures the profound complexity of the Japanese soldiers' early perceptions. From the outset, the Japanese military culture was steeped in centuries-old traditions of honor, sacrifice, and a solemn code that valorized death over surrender. The Bushido spirit, ingrained deeply within every soldier, dictated a rigid framework for understanding combat and the enemy. Yet, these ideals were immediately challenged by the blunt reality of the American infantryman's presence. The GIs did not conform to the archetype of a noble adversary. They were pragmatic, often loud, and driven less by ritual than by an unyielding determination to survive and to prevail. Initial encounters were colored by stereotypes and misconceptions. Japanese forces, influenced by pre-war propaganda and cultural isolation, had viewed Western soldiers as somewhat undisciplined and lacking the spiritual fortitude that defined their own warriors. Captain Tanaka, who fought on Guadalcanal in 1942, remarked in a post-war interview, "We believed the GIs were careless and weak, that they would break under pressure. This is false." His words echo the disillusionment felt by many as their early assumptions crumbled in the face of American tenacity. The clash on Guadalcanal marked a significant turning point. Japanese troops, accustomed to swift, decisive engagements, were met instead with relentless resistance. The American soldiers exhibited a stubbornness that confounded their Japanese counterparts. They dug in, held ground, and counterattacked with a ferocity that belied their seemingly casual demeanor. The GI's use of combined arms, coordinated infantry, artillery, and air support was a novel experience for the Japanese, who had not often faced such well-synchronized tactics in jungle warfare. One sergeant, Kuroda, vividly described the bewildering sight during a night assault. "They never stopped. Even when we thought we had them cornered, they would emerge from the darkness, firing, shouting, pressing forward. It was as if their spirit could not be broken." This relentless spirit unsettled many Japanese soldiers, who had been trained to expect an enemy who would yield honorably or fall silently. The early months of 1942 were a crucible in which Japanese perceptions began to shift. Reports circulated among units, cautioning against underestimating the Americans. Yet, these warnings did not immediately erase the cultural gulf. The GI's apparent lack of concern for traditional warfare courtesies, such as formal declarations or adherence to an enemy's code of conduct, was perplexing. The Americans fought with a pragmatism that seemed cold and relentless, prioritizing survival and mission success above all else. Moreover, the social fabric of the American soldier was alien to the Japanese. The GIs often displayed a camaraderie and humor amidst the horrors of battle that contrasted starkly with the solemn stoicism expected of Japanese troops. This behavior was sometimes misinterpreted as frivolity or disrespect, further deepening the cultural divide. Yet, beneath the surface of these early encounters, a grudging respect began to form. The Japanese recognized the GI's capacity for endurance and adaptability. Despite the hardships of jungle disease, supply shortages, and brutal combat conditions, American soldiers maintained their positions and pressed forward. This resilience was something Japanese commanders found difficult to counter, as it defied the logic of their own battlefield experiences. Lieutenant Hayashi noted in his diary a moment of grim realization. "Our traditions taught us to face death with dignity, but the GI's sheer numbers and firepower challenged the very core of our convictions." The psychological impact of facing an enemy who seemed unfazed by death and capable of absorbing staggering losses was profound. It sowed seeds of doubt and unease among the ranks, eroding the certainty that had once underpinned Japanese martial resolve. The initial phase of the Pacific conflict thus established a paradoxical image of the American GI in the Japanese mind. On one hand, He was a relentless, almost mechanical force of destruction, an enemy devoid of the honor and grace that framed Japanese ideals of warfare. On the other, he was a symbol of an invincible will, a human embodiment of determination that could not be extinguished by conventional means. This duality was evident in the private writings of soldiers. Corporal Saito, wounded during the early fighting, wrote, "They fight not for glory or death, but for life itself. This is strange to us, but it makes them terrible foes." Here, the cultural chasm becomes apparent. Where Japanese warriors revered the acceptance of death as a pathway to honor, the Americans' fierce clinging to life and survival was both alien and formidable. The initial shock was compounded by the unfamiliarity of the terrain and the logistical challenges faced by Japanese forces. The dense jungles, oppressive heat, and disease proved as much an enemy as the Americans themselves. Yet the GIs appeared to navigate these obstacles with a pragmatism that defied the Japanese expectation of an honorable fight conducted on equal terms. In this environment, the Japanese soldiers' perceptions evolved from disdain to cautious admiration tinged with fear. The GIs were no longer faceless invaders, but formidable adversaries whose methods, though lacking in traditional honor, were undeniably effective. This recognition did not dissolve the deep cultural misunderstandings, but added a layer of complexity to the Japanese wartime psyche. The stories of individual warriors illuminate this transformation. Private Nakamura, who fought on Guadalcanal, remembered an incident where American soldiers, after a fierce firefight, distributed rations among their comrades with a quiet efficiency that contrasted sharply with the ritualized ceremonies of Japanese units. They did not boast or pray before eating, he recalled, but their focus was absolute. It was a different kind of discipline, one that we struggled to understand. Such observations underscored the fundamental differences in combat philosophy, where Japanese soldiers adhered to a code that prized sacrifice and spiritual purity. The Americans embraced a utilitarian ethic centered on mission accomplishment and survival. This divergence shaped the Japanese perception of the GIs as both alien and unervingly effective. As the war progressed, these early impressions would deepen, influenced by the mounting casualties and brutal engagements that followed. But in these initial moments, amid the sweltering jungles and the chaos of battle, the Japanese warriors confronted a paradox, an enemy who defied their expectations not only in tactics and firepower, but in the very nature of what it meant to fight and to endure. The experience forged a complex legacy, one recorded in countless diaries, letters, and testimonies that reveal a nuanced portrait of the American GI as seen through Japanese eyes, an adversary who was at once a source of fear, frustration, and a grudging respect born from the harsh realities of war. Lieutenant Hayashi's words linger. "We were taught to expect a noble enemy, yet the GIs fought with a pragmatism that seemed cold and relentless. This challenged everything we believed." As the war dragged into the latter months of 1942, the shadows cast by the initial encounters on Guadalcanal grew longer and more complex in the minds of Japanese warriors. The early underestimation of American GIs, steeped in cultural pride and doctrinal certainty, began to unravel amidst the brutal realities of prolonged combat. The initial stereotypes, that these Western soldiers were undisciplined, lacking spiritual depth, and fragile under pressure, proved dangerously false. This realization dawned slowly and painfully, marking a critical shift in Japanese attitudes. The battlefields of Guadalcanal became a crucible for this transformation. Japanese troops, trained in a doctrine emphasizing swift, decisive strikes and the sanctity of honor in combat, found themselves locked in a grueling war of attrition. The Americans, far from the disorganized caricatures imagined in Tokyo, displayed a tenacity and tactical flexibility previously unanticipated. Captain Ishikawa, a veteran of the campaign, recalled in a post-war interview, "We thought them reckless children, but they adapted quickly, learned the jungle as well as we did, and kept coming." This adaptability was a source of profound frustration. The Japanese command structure, rigid and hierarchical, found it difficult to respond effectively to the GIs' evolving tactics. American soldiers employed a methodical approach, combining infantry maneuvers with artillery and air support in ways that overwhelmed Japanese positions. The use of suppressive fire, coordinated flanking movements, and rapid entrenchment reflected a level of tactical sophistication that challenged Japanese assumptions. Lieutenant Nakamura observed, "They fought not just with weapons, but with a strategy that seemed to change with each encounter. When we expected them to retreat, they held fast. When we tried to encircle them, they broke through with force." Such adaptability unsettled many Japanese officers, who were accustomed to a more predictable style of warfare rooted in the traditions of honor and sacrifice. Moreover, the GI's combat style was marked by a pragmatism that contrasted sharply with Japanese ideals. While Japanese soldiers were often prepared to accept death rather than surrender or retreat, American troops prioritized survival and mission accomplishment. This practical mindset was encapsulated in the repeated observation among Japanese veterans: "They never stopped." This phrase, uttered with a mixture of awe and despair, reflected the relentless pressure the GIs exerted on Japanese lines. The Americans' willingness to sustain heavy casualties and continue fighting was both baffling and intimidating. It challenged the Japanese belief that an enemy who refused to die honorably would ultimately falter. Instead, the GI's endurance appeared inexhaustible, their morale buoyed by effective logistics, medical support, and leadership that emphasized cohesion over ritual. This approach was vividly demonstrated in the battle for Henderson Field, where American forces held a critical airstrip against repeated Japanese assaults. The Japanese commanders had expected that their spirit and willingness to sacrifice would prevail, yet the GI's steadfast defense, backed by artillery and air strikes, repelled attack after attack. Captain Tanaka, reflecting on this phase, stated, "We believed in honor and sacrifice, yet these Americans fought with a pragmatism that seemed cold and relentless. They cared little for glory. They fought to live and to win." This cold pragmatism was compounded by the GI's use of superior firepower and technology. Machine guns, mortars, and artillery were employed with devastating efficiency, often coordinated through radio communication, a capability that Japanese forces struggled to match. The Americans' tactical doctrine emphasized suppressive fire and coordinated assaults, enabling them to neutralize Japanese positions before launching infantry advances. Sergeant Kuroda, who experienced these assaults firsthand, recounted, "Their bullets never ceased. When we tried to counterattack, their machine guns cut through our ranks. We were unprepared for such overwhelming firepower." The psychological effect of facing this barrage was profound. It eroded morale and shattered the illusion that the enemy could be overcome by sheer will alone. The GI's combat style also revealed a distinct emphasis on teamwork and mutual support. Japanese soldiers noted the cohesion among American squads, who moved and fought as a single unit rather than as isolated fighters. This cohesion was reinforced by rigorous training and leadership that encouraged initiative within a disciplined framework, contrasting with the often rigid and hierarchical command style of the Japanese military. Furthermore, the Americans' ability to improvise and adapt to jungle warfare defied Japanese expectations. Initially perceived as ill-suited to tropical combat, GIs quickly learned to navigate the terrain, utilize camouflage, and employ guerrilla tactics when necessary. This adaptability was a source of admiration and concern. Lieutenant Hayashi wrote, "We thought they would be easy prey in the jungle, but they became masters of it, as much as we were." The psychological impact of this evolving combat experience was significant. Japanese soldiers grappled with the realization that their enemy was neither fragile nor predictable. The GI's resilience, combined with their tactical innovation, eroded Japanese confidence and sowed confusion. This was compounded by a growing awareness of the Americans' superior logistical capabilities, which ensured steady supplies of ammunition, food, and reinforcements. The contrast between the two forces extended beyond tactics and equipment into the realm of morale and psychological endurance. Japanese troops were often isolated, facing dwindling supplies and disease, yet expected to fight to the death. American soldiers, though far from home and encircled by a hostile jungle, maintained a fighting spirit bolstered by rotation policies, medical care, and communication with the rear. This disparity was keenly felt during the protracted battles on Guadalcanal. Private Saito noted, "Their faces showed weariness, but not despair. We, too, were weary, but the thought of returning home was distant. They fought for survival. We fought for honor. This reflection encapsulates the fundamental psychological divide that shaped Japanese perceptions of the American GI. In sum, the historical context of the early Pacific battles brought to light the stark contrast between Japanese expectations and the reality of American infantrymen. The initial underestimation of the enemy was shattered by encounters that revealed a disciplined, resilient, and tactically adept foe. The GI's combat style, marked by pragmatism, adaptability, and unyielding determination, challenged the prevailing Japanese military doctrine and forced a re-evaluation of the nature of the adversary. As Captain Ishikawa lamented, "We prepared to face warriors who fought with sword and spirit, but instead found men who fought with fire and steel, who never yielded nor faltered." This sober admission underscores the profound shift in Japanese attitudes engendered by the early battles, a shift that would resonate throughout the war and shape the complex, often conflicted perceptions of American soldiers held by Japanese warriors. The battles that unfolded on Saipan and Okinawa would come to define the brutal reality of facing American GIs for Japanese soldiers, etching indelible impressions that melded fear, frustration, and an uneasy respect. These engagements, marked by intense combat and staggering casualties, exposed the Japanese warriors to the full measure of the Americans' combined arms tactics, relentless firepower, and unyielding determination, qualities that profoundly shaped their psychological and cultural perceptions. Saipan, invaded by American forces in June 1944, was a battlefield unlike any the Japanese had previously encountered. The island's rugged terrain, fortified defensive positions, and dense vegetation created a deadly theater where traditional Japanese tactics met the overwhelming firepower and coordination of the GIs. Captain Morita, who commanded a company during the battle, later reflected, "We had prepared for a fight of honor, a last stand filled with valor. Instead, we faced an enemy who encircled us with steel and fire, who advanced as though invincible." The Americans employed a sophisticated integration of infantry, artillery, tanks, and naval gunfire, supported by airstrikes that decimated Japanese positions. This combined arms approach overwhelmed Japanese defenses, which had been constructed with the expectation of facing infantry assaults rather than such multifaceted attacks. The GI's ability to synchronize these elements created a tactical environment where Japanese soldiers found themselves increasingly isolated and vulnerable. Lieutenant Saito, who survived the initial assaults, described the psychological toll. "Their guns thundered ceaselessly. We were pinned down, unable to move without being cut down. The firepower was unlike anything we had known. It was as if the earth itself was against us." This relentless barrage eroded not only physical defenses, but also the morale of Japanese troops, who struggled to reconcile their ideals of steadfastness with the crushing reality of modern warfare. The Americans' combat style emphasized not only superior firepower, but also a tactical patience that confounded Japanese expectations. Rather than seeking immediate, decisive engagements, the GIs advanced methodically, exploiting weaknesses and consolidating gains. This approach frustrated Japanese commanders, who had anticipated that their enemy would either break or be decisively defeated in swift encounters. Sergeant Nakamura recounted an instance during the battle when American soldiers, after capturing a key position, rapidly established defensive perimeters and prepared for counterattacks. "They never allowed us a moment's rest," he noted. "Their discipline and speed in fortifying positions were remarkable. We could not find openings to strike back." This tactical tenacity imposed a grueling tempo on Japanese forces, forcing them into a reactive posture unfamiliar and demoralizing. Okinawa, invaded in April 1945, further intensified these psychological confrontations. The island's extensive cave networks and fortified positions offered Japanese troops opportunities for prolonged resistance, yet the Americans' persistent assaults and innovative tactics gradually wore down these defenses. The battle became a testament to the Americans' capacity for enduring hardship and leveraging overwhelming resources. Japanese soldiers observed that the GIs combined ferocity with strategic patience, often accepting heavy casualties to secure incremental advances. Captain Tanaka noted, We faced men who would crawl through mud and blood, who would rise again after being knocked down. Their determination was unlike anything we had seen. This dogged persistence, coupled with superior firepower, imposed a relentless pressure that tested the limits of Japanese endurance. The psychological warfare extended beyond mere tactics. The Americans' use of flamethrowers and explosives to clear caves and bunkers introduced a terrifying dimension. Lieutenant Hayashi described the horror. They brought fire to the darkness where we sought refuge. We were forced into open combat or death by flame. This was no honorable fight. It was survival against annihilation. The use of such weapons contributed to the perception of the Americans as ruthless, pragmatic fighters unconcerned with traditional codes of combat. Furthermore, the GIs' capacity to sustain casualties and maintain supply lines impressed and unsettled Japanese soldiers. The logistical support ensured that American troops were rarely outmatched in ammunition or medical care, allowing them to continue fighting long after Japanese forces were exhausted. This endurance contributed to the image of an inexhaustible adversary, a force that never stopped, as countless Japanese veterans would attest. The psychological contrast was stark. Japanese soldiers, often isolated and cut off from reinforcements, faced dwindling supplies and the burden of an ethos that demanded death over retreat. In contrast, the Americans fought with a pragmatism that valued life and mission above all else. This divergence created a cognitive dissonance among Japanese troops, caught between admiration for the enemy's tenacity and frustration at their own untenable position. Private Saito wrote in a letter during the Okinawa campaign, "They do not fight for glory or honor, but for survival and victory. This is strange to us. Our lives are given to the emperor, theirs are given to the cause." This observation highlights the cultural chasm that underpinned Japanese perceptions, where the Americans' practical approach to warfare was both alien and effective. Despite the terror and hardship, Japanese soldiers occasionally acknowledged the human qualities of their adversaries. Stories circulated of American soldiers showing moments of kindness, treating prisoners humanely, or aiding wounded comrades with dedication. Such accounts complicated the simplistic image of the enemy as a faceless machine, revealing a complicated humanity beneath the brutal exterior. Yet, these glimpses of common humanity did not diminish the overwhelming impression of the Americans' combat effectiveness. The combination of firepower, tactical coordination, and psychological resilience forged an adversary who was both respected and feared. This duality permeated Japanese narratives of the battles, reflecting a complex emotional landscape. The accounts of officers and enlisted men alike reveal a shared struggle to comprehend the nature of the American GI. Lieutenant Nakamura concluded, "They were warriors of a different kind, not bound by our codes, not moved by our traditions, but driven by something equally powerful, an unbreakable will to survive and to win." This recognition, born from the crucible of Saipan and Okinawa, encapsulated the evolving perception of the enemy. In these fierce confrontations, Japanese warriors confronted not only an adversary armed with superior technology and tactics, but also a mindset that challenged their deepest convictions. The Americans' pragmatic, relentless approach to combat shattered illusions and forced a reevaluation of what it meant to be a soldier in modern war. The legacy of these battles would endure long after the guns fell silent, shaping the memories and reflections of Japanese veterans. The GIs they faced were neither mythical embodiments of evil nor mere faceless invaders. They were complex adversaries whose determination and adaptability left an indelible mark on the Japanese wartime psyche. As Captain Morita solemnly observed, "We fought men who had no fear of death, but who valued life so fiercely that they would endure any hardship to hold it." This is the paradox we faced, and the truth we had to accept. The cultural chasm that separated Japanese warriors from American GIs was as vast and daunting as the physical battlefields they fought upon. Beneath the surface of tactical engagements lay profound misunderstandings, shaped by differing worldviews, wartime propaganda, and deeply entrenched values. This complex interplay of perception and misperception colored Japanese soldiers' views of their American adversaries, weaving a tapestry of fear, disdain, and reluctant respect. Japanese military doctrine, rooted in Bushido and centuries of martial tradition, emphasized honor, sacrifice, and a ritualized approach to combat. Soldiers were taught to face death with dignity, to accept it as the ultimate act of loyalty to the emperor and nation. This code shaped not only battlefield behavior, but also the psychological framework through which enemies were judged. To fight with honor was to embrace death nobly. To survive at any cost was often viewed with suspicion or contempt. In stark contrast, American GIs were perceived as pragmatic warriors who prioritized survival and mission success above ritual or ideology. This was a source of bewilderment and, at times, disdain among Japanese soldiers. Lieutenant Hayashi noted, "We were taught to expect an enemy who would die honorably, yet the GIs fought with a determination to live and return home. This was a challenge to our very understanding of warfare." The Americans' pragmatic approach, seen as cold and relentless, conflicted with Japanese ideals, creating a sense of cultural otherness. Propaganda further deepened these divides. Japanese media and military communications often portrayed American soldiers as uncultured brutes, lacking spirituality and boundless in their ruthlessness. This demonization served to bolster Japanese morale and justify the brutal nature of the conflict, but also warped perceptions. Soldiers were told to expect an enemy devoid of honor or mercy, a view that clashed with the realities witnessed on the battlefield. Yet, the truth was far more nuanced. Many Japanese soldiers found themselves confronting adversaries who, while brutal in combat, also displayed discipline, cohesion, and moments of unexpected humanity. Corporal Saito recalled, "We heard stories of GIs who treated prisoners with kindness or helped wounded comrades without hesitation. This did not fit the monstrous image we had been given." These contradictions unsettled Japanese troops, forcing them to reconcile propaganda with lived experience. The cultural misunderstandings extended into battlefield conduct and psychological warfare. Japanese forces were often bewildered by the GI's use of loud, boisterous communication, humor in the face of danger, and refusal to adhere to formal combat rituals. This behavior was sometimes interpreted as disrespect or a lack of seriousness, further alienating the Japanese soldiers who valued stoicism and solemnity. Moreover, the Americans' tactical pragmatism, employing overwhelming firepower, artillery barges, and airstrikes, was seen by some Japanese as a violation of the honorable way to fight. Lieutenant Nakamura lamented, "Their weapons were not just tools but instruments of destruction that showed no regard for the spirit of the warrior." This pragmatism was cold and unyielding. To Japanese eyes, such tactics betrayed a ruthless efficiency that disregarded the sacredness of combat. Despite these differences, there was an undercurrent of grudging respect. Japanese soldiers acknowledged the effectiveness of American methods and the resilience that underpinned them. The GI's ability to endure hardship, maintain morale, and adapt quickly to the harsh conditions of Pacific warfare challenged Japanese preconceptions. Captain Tanaka reflected, "Though we did not understand their ways, we could not deny their strength and will." This respect was often tempered by frustration and the pain of facing a seemingly unstoppable foe. The psychological impact of these cultural contrasts was profound. Japanese soldiers struggled with feelings of inadequacy and confusion. Their traditional ideals offered little guidance on how to confront an enemy who fought without the same codes of honor. This led to a crisis of morale in some units, as the old certainties were eroded by the relentless pragmatism of the Americans. Furthermore, the interplay of propaganda and battlefield experience created a complex emotional landscape. Soldiers were torn between the vilification of the enemy and the undeniable facts of their tenacity and humanity. This duality fostered a sense of ambivalence, reflected in the diaries and letters of many Japanese veterans. Private Nakamura wrote, "We were told they were monsters, but in the mud and blood, they were men like us, fearful, determined, and stubborn." These words reveal the internal conflict faced by Japanese warriors, caught between cultural conditioning and the harsh truths of war. The influence of propaganda also extended to the broader Japanese society, shaping public perceptions of the American soldier. This societal lens reinforced stereotypes and fueled a narrative of righteous struggle against a dehumanized enemy. Yet, Soldiers at the front lines often found this narrative at odds with their direct encounters, complicating their understanding and feelings toward the GIs. This dynamic affected combat behavior as well. The fear of an enemy perceived as ruthless and unorthodox sometimes led to heightened anxiety and defensive postures among Japanese troops. Conversely, the recognition of the Americans' tactical skill and determination inspired fierce resistance, and, in some cases, desperate measures such as banzai charges, actions driven by a desire to reclaim honor in the face of overwhelming odds. Lieutenant Hayashi summarized this tension. Honor and pragmatism were locked in a grim dance. We fought for our code, but the GIs fought for survival. Neither way was wholly right or wrong, but both shaped the terrible reality we endured. This observation encapsulates the psychological and cultural clash that defined Japanese perceptions of American soldiers, a clash that was as much about identity and values as it was about battlefield tactics. In the end, the complex mosaic of cultural misunderstandings, propaganda influence, and direct experience forged a multifaceted image of the American GI in Japanese minds. He was at once a feared and respected adversary, embodying a form of warfare that challenged traditional notions of honor and combat. This evolving perception would leave a lasting imprint on Japanese veterans and shape post-war reflections on the conflict. The interplay of fear, respect, and confusion created a narrative that transcended simple enemy stereotypes. Japanese warriors came to see the GIs as embodiments of a new kind of soldier, one defined not by ritual or tradition, but by determination, adaptability, and a pragmatic will to endure. This realization marked a profound shift in Japanese understanding of their adversaries, setting the stage for the final reflections that would emerge in the war's aftermath. In the quiet aftermath of war, as the smoke cleared from the shattered islands and the echoes of gunfire faded into memory, Japanese veterans began to reflect with a somber clarity on the American GIs they had faced. These reflections, gathered through interviews, diaries, and personal testimonies, reveal a transformation in perception, an evolution from fear and misunderstanding to acknowledgement and respect, albeit tinged with the tragic inevitability of defeat. Many veterans recounted the initial shock of confronting an enemy whose resilience and tenacity defied their expectations. Lieutenant Hayashi, in a post-war interview, confessed, "We were taught to expect a noble enemy who would accept death with dignity. Instead, we found men who fought with a relentless will to survive and to win. This was a revelation that changed everything." His words encapsulate the collective realization that the American soldier represented a formidable force shaped by different values, but no less formidable. This grudging respect was often accompanied by a deep sense of loss and reflection on what the war had cost. The Japanese soldiers recognized that the Americans' effectiveness was not merely a product of superior firepower, but also of an unyielding determination and tactical flexibility. Captain Morita observed, "Their strength was not in just their weapons, but in their spirit, their refusal to give up even when all seemed lost. It was this determination that led to our defeat." Veterans also grappled with the cultural contrasts that had shaped their wartime perceptions. The Bushido Code, which had guided their actions and understanding of honor, seemed at odds with the Americans' pragmatic approach. Yet, in hindsight, many acknowledged that this clash of values had defined the brutal nature of their encounters. Lieutenant Nakamura reflected, "We fought men who valued life differently. Their pragmatism was unfamiliar, but no less honorable in its own way. It forced us to reconsider what it meant to be a warrior." These reflections extended beyond the battlefield to shape post-war attitudes within Japan. The experiences of facing the American GI influenced Japan's military and cultural outlook in the decades that followed, fostering a cautious respect for the practical and technological prowess of the United States. The image of the American soldier evolved from a demonized enemy to a symbol of modern military power and resilience. Personal testimonies reveal a nuanced understanding of the Americans' humanity amidst the horrors of war. Private Saito recounted, "Despite the violence, there were moments when we saw their kindness, how they cared for wounded comrades or treated prisoners with dignity. These moments complicated our hatred and forced us to see them as men, not monsters." Such admissions reveal the complexity of emotions experienced by Japanese soldiers, torn between enmity and empathy. The psychological impact of these wartime experiences lingered long after hostilities ceased. Many veterans struggled to reconcile their cultural ideals with the realities they had witnessed. The Americans' unyielding will and tactical pragmatism challenged the Japanese notions of honor and sacrifice, prompting introspection and, in some cases, a re-evaluation of traditional values. Lieutenant Hayashi's final reflections encapsulate this tragic inevitability. We fought with the hope that our code would prevail, that our honor would outlast their numbers and firepower. But the GIs never stopped. Their determination was a force we could not overcome, and it marked the end of our way of war. His words resonate with the somber acceptance shared by many, a recognition that the clash of cultures and combat doctrines had shaped the course of history with unforgiving clarity. The legacy of these reflections is profound. Japanese veterans' testimonies provide a window into the complex interplay of fear, respect, and cultural confrontation that define their perception of American GIs. This legacy informs not only historical understanding, but also the broader narrative of reconciliation and mutual respect that emerged in the post-war era. As the war's shadows recede, the voices of those who fought offer a poignant reminder of the human dimension behind the clash of armies. Their stories reveal that beneath the brutal facade of warfare lay encounters between men shaped by vastly different worlds, each struggling to understand the other amid the relentless crucible of combat. In the end, the Japanese soldiers who faced the American GIs came to embody a tragic paradox. Warriors bound by ancient codes confronted by an enemy whose determination was forged in pragmatism rather than ritual. This encounter reshaped their perceptions, challenged their beliefs, and left an enduring mark on the collective memory of a nation. Lieutenant Hayashi, in his final recorded words, reflected, "The GIs fought not for glory but for survival, and in their determination, we saw the future of warfare. We were defeated not just by their weapons, but by their will, a will that never stopped."